Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for joining our event today, which is part of our Microsoft Masterclass Series, where we've been going through various topics on the Microsoft 365 platform. You may have joined the previous one, which was all about building a Microsoft 365 strategy. So I'd recommend that you catch up on that. Some of the pieces that we'll discuss today will tie into that as well. So just to cover the agenda that we're going to go through today, we're going to talk through the strategy and vision planning. We'll talk about how communications are the most important part of any plan that we put in place. We'll talk through how to approach the change management for organizations and make sure that once we start to roll out these technologies and services that people are adopting them and using them. We'll talk about how champions can make a big impact on your adoption strategy. And we'll also then end with resources and certifications that are available. And if you guys have any questions, feel free to use the Q&A feature as we go through today, and I'll answer those at the end as well. My name's Hugh Valentine. I'm a specialist of Microsoft 365 and digital transformation, and I'm also the managing director here at Valto. And I hope that today's takeaways for you will be how you can adopt Microsoft 365 in your organization, how you can develop a strategy, and some tips and tricks that we have figured out along the way as well. There's someone reported that there has a lag with the sound. I'm just quick sound check if anybody else is experiencing any issues with the sound. Could you just post a quick question for me in the chat and I'll make sure I can fix that. It could be that the person who has joined, you may have it open twice, so you may want to just check your sound settings and make sure you haven't clicked the link twice. But nobody else has reported that issue. So we'll make a start. The first piece then is really key to this is around the strategy and the vision planning for the Microsoft 365 platform. So what I would recommend really is going back to our previous session where we talked around Microsoft 365 strategy in much more detail. So really the key part before we look at any adoption is figuring how are we going to roll these platforms out? What are the services that we're going to use and how are we going to start to get people on board with them? So the last session really covered that in a lot more detail, but I've got here a quick summary of a timeline that a company may look to roll out the services for Microsoft 365. So we often start the journey. We have a Microsoft 365 strategy planning workshop, but you can also do that internally as well. The aim of this really is to figure out what services are we looking to adopt, how are we going to migrate to them, and what things are we going to activate in there. So you can see my plan here has initially the Microsoft 365 strategy planning. Following alongside that, we also have an adoption strategy planning workshop, of which we're going to just talk about in detail today. Now, there's so many applications that are available in Microsoft 365, it's not feasible for you guys to magically push a button one day and SharePoint, Teams, Exchange, and everything suddenly rolled out and adopted. The users just can't handle that level of change. So what we would recommend is that your roadmap is factoring in what is a reasonable expectation. As users get used to a service like Exchange, which is very easy for them to get used to, or then we start to look at SharePoint, the key is to start to get them on board with understanding some of those feature sets, getting them comfortable with it, and then looking to roll out another platform. So we may start off the journey with a SharePoint intranet, which is mainly just people diving in to grab the information that they'd like to see. And then once they've got au fait with that and they're comfortable, we may then start to look at Microsoft Teams and rolling that out. So the very first piece is just defining your strategy and making sure you have a clear timeline. And once we know that, we can start to fit in the change management and the adoption around this. Now, we've worked with lots of organizations, and often the piece that they lack is the vision for the platform. So the very first thing we do when we start to look at an adoption strategy is to try and work with our organization to come up with a vision for what these services will be used for. So if you were explaining to someone in a lift very briefly, what is the plan for Office 365? How are we going to use it? What does it mean? And similarly, with Microsoft Teams. There's an example here of an Office 365 vision where we're just clearly outlining that we expect this to become our centralized environment, and all activities, documents, and collaboration will happen in this Office 365 platform. So it's very clear then for the leadership team in your organization to convey the message of what you're aiming to do with Office 365. If you don't have this vision and you're going off and launching all of the products, it's very difficult for your end users to tie in, well, what does this mean? What is it for? And if we just clearly outline to people to say, our plan with this is we're going to move all of our documents in, we're going to have this as the collaboration platform, it becomes much easier when we start to do adoption and training that we can push this vision to the rest of the organization. Similarly, with Microsoft Teams, I have a very clear plan here for what I would expect to do with that. Lots of organizations like to use Microsoft Teams and they have this ambition that they would like to roll it out and completely replace internal emails, but they often don't convey that message to the end users or the rest of the organization. If the real objective of this platform is to get rid of internal emails, we need to clearly outline and tell that to the users at the very beginning. And that way, everyone can work to the same goal, they have the same vision, and they all know that that's exactly what we have. If we're not clear about that goal, for example, replacing internal emails, it's never going to happen because the users aren't on the same path as you. It's in the back of your mind that that's what you intend to do. So I would recommend for each of the services that you guys plan to roll out, you look at creating a very simple vision. And then if you start to do training sessions and roll this platform out and any communications that you're sending out, you're clearly tying that vision back to the training. So every time we do a Microsoft Teams training session with an organization and they clearly have this vision, we will be telling them the plan for this platform is to replace internal emails, and this is how you're going to achieve it, as opposed to just a training session that's showing people all of the features and the functions of Microsoft Teams, but no real goal for the platform. Next piece is around communications. So often lacking is trying to create a clear and concise communications plan for your organization. So before we start any ongoing training or we start any rollout of these services, we would recommend that you sit down at the very beginning and identify exactly what are the communications that are going to be sent out to that organization. So in my sample one I have here, we have a project introduction email issued. So this could be posted in your emails, it could be an intranet news post, whatever method of communication you guys currently have. When we have this project introduction, this should be an email to the entire organization with your vision and outlining exactly what you plan for this project. So a simple, hey guys, we're launching Office 365. This is going to become our central collaboration tool. And on the back of this, we're going to start to use SharePoint as an intranet solution. We're going to use Microsoft Teams to start to replace internal emails. So from the outset, we can send this project introduction to everyone in the company. If you've had the opportunity to have an overview of Microsoft 365, which we've done in many of our YouTube sessions, or if you've created your own, it's often a good idea to put the video in there to give people a feel of what's coming. You can give them a brief overview of Teams and how that's going to work, a brief overview of SharePoint. But in essence, that project introduction email is key to start to get people thinking about what this is going to mean to them and how we can get excited for the platform. We also have a champion email issued. So we're going to talk about this as we go through the session, but we would really highly recommend you start to recruit champions. And one of the best ways to do that is a simple email out to your organization initially to ask people if they want to be a champion. They're definitely going to be willing. And if people are excited and they want to be champions, they're going to be much more successful than trying to shoehorn someone in that doesn't necessarily want to do that role. So as part of our project introduction, we're also trying to do that initial call for champions and get those recruited into the business. We've also got a segment here for the senior leadership team. Once we've defined our strategy for 365 and we've defined our strategy for Microsoft 365 adoption, the senior leadership team need to be informed of what that plan is. They'll definitely be aware of the platform and they'll be aware of the buying decisions that we've been made to go through and purchase Office 365. But what we then need to do is spell out to the senior leadership team, right, we are launching Microsoft 365 across the organization. We've created these visions. This is how we expect the users to start to use it. And then within that session with the senior leadership team, it's about basically trying to give them the tools and the knowledge that they can use then to convey this message across their teams. So once they've been given the demonstration, they know exactly what our goals are with the platform, we should educate that team so they can be the source of authority for each of the teams and make sure that's being rolled out across the organization. So there's 3 very quick things that we do at the very start of this project to get people up to speed with what's going to be happening with this platform. Across this, we also have some training sessions. So obviously any part of a good adoption strategy will have specific training sessions for the various users, which we'll talk about in more detail as we go through. But we find it's very good to create that initial change communications plan, put that in a document, and then it's very clear to see the timetable of what's coming and the key kind of points of this project. Now, a big part of Microsoft 365 and adoption is the change management for this platform. One of the biggest mistakes that we see companies making is that they train their users with no context of what they plan to do. So let's take Microsoft Teams. If we train users on every single feature and function that exists in the Microsoft Teams platform, they are going to get overloaded with the functionality. They will understand how to set up a meeting, they'll understand how to do a chat, but what they often lack is how do I apply that to my day-to-day role? And I'll go through an example in a minute of a typical process for Microsoft Teams, and then you can take this away to kind of adopt it with other services. So where we see organizations who've done just a simple training session, what we see is an initial burst of adoption. Everyone's excited, they've had the training. You'll see that your stats boost for perhaps a month after that process, but then we see a sharp drop then because what's been missing is actually how are they going to adopt that? How are they going to use it? So they get excited about the functionality, they test, they use it, but then they're missing that kind of tie into the way they're working and what they need to do. So that adoption doesn't really kick off and isn't successful. So I wouldn't recommend that you guys in your organizations just train users on the features and then expect that to be good enough for adoption. At the very bottom here, what we'd expect is a very good way to get this is to map the features to departments and teams. So I wanted to show an example here of Microsoft Teams, but you can take a similar approach for everything, whether it's SharePoint or any other services in here. So what we often start with to kind of convey the message of what are we going to use these platforms for? So I have a very simple infographic here, which is a tool that we'd use as part of the adoption journey. And what we're doing in here is kind of conveying to an organization, what are the key tools that we could use? So as I said before, having a clear vision. So I've kind of got SharePoint, OneDrive and Microsoft Teams as 3 tools here, all of which have the capability of storing files and being used for collaboration. So it can be very confusing for the user to figure out which one should they be using. And it doesn't help that the Teams backend is also built on SharePoint. So what we want to do first of all is educate our users to say, right, here's the 3 tools. And as part of our adoption strategy, we have defined SharePoint as a company-wide tool. So what this means is it's going to become a publishing portal. And when we need to find information in our organization, SharePoint is the place for that. It will be an intranet, it will contain our policies, it will have departmental areas that are open to everybody, and that will have things like frequently asked questions, documents, and templates. So whenever someone thinks and connects the dots with SharePoint, that is our public place in an organization where we're going to publicly put information like policies. We then have OneDrive, which very quickly we can use to store our personal documentation, so documents, files. And then finally, we have Teams. So my example I mentioned at the beginning is to basically try and make sure that the user can tie all of these features and functions back to how they work as a department or a team. So jumping into the second infographic, in our organization, we've got a very clear methodology of how we're going to use Microsoft Teams. So it can do a lot more than just arranging meetings for your organization. It can fully replace internal emails. It can be used for storing your files instead of using a file server. So what we've done here is map the 4 types of teams that we'd expect to see in our organization. We expect to see departmental teams. The purpose of a departmental team, and again, our objective, if we're trying to replace internal emails, we have to tell people as much as possible that's the aim. So when we create a departmental team, we expect that would replace internal emails. Communications would be with the group chats, and we'd expect that regular departmental meetings are held and all of the files are within this platform. So now it's very easy for all departments in our organization to clearly see this is how we're going to operate within the company, and this is how departments will use Teams. The second piece is around projects. So if we're going to create a project, then I'm going to spin up a team, and I'm going to then invite external parties if I need to, and I'm going to use things like Planner and the files management. So again, it's just a very clear, this is how we run projects in the organization, and this is how we expect you guys would use Teams to do that. We also have a company-wide team, and the idea of this one is for important announcements. So for things like praising staff, putting company news, and maybe even a link to the SharePoint intranet. And then finally, this could be Yammer in some of your organizations, but we could also look at creating a social and initiative team. So if you guys are going to run a mental health campaign in the company, then you could create a Microsoft team or a Yammer group for that. So in essence, what I'm demonstrating here is it's very easy now for us to distribute this across the company, and people who are in a finance department can easily see how this ties into their way of working. We're setting the expectations of what we want them to do. If they're running a project, we're also doing that. So it becomes now applying the features and functions that exist within Teams to how this department would operate. And we'll come back to that in a second. So the next piece then is we can then look to create a cheat sheet. So a cheat sheet in an organization is effectively, you can see an example of a cheat sheet here, which is published on our SharePoint Online intranet. And what we want to do is clearly explain how a department in that organization is going to use Microsoft Teams. So at the very top here, we have a vision. So the vision is obviously, as I mentioned before, to use Teams as our primary communication channel. And then we've got some specific use cases here. So we spend a lot of time mapping out how a department currently works. So they might do daily stand-ups in an organization, which in the old way of working meant they all hold around a desk in an office. They can't do that anymore. So we'll replace those office stand-ups with daily Teams meetings. So that's a very easy switch. Everyone, no matter whether they're technologically capable or not, understands how they currently do an office daily stand-up, and now that can be replaced with Microsoft Teams. We'll also look at creating a weekly catch-up, and we'll look at recording that so we can have the advantage of people being able to play that back. And we'll finally look at replacing internal emails, which I've mentioned before. So we spend this time with each of the departments, we figure out the way that they currently work, and then we come back and we clearly map how we'd expect them to use Teams. So we can say every morning at 8:30, you can spin up a daily catch up using Microsoft Teams. People who are in the office can join, people who are at home can join, and it becomes very easy for them to be part of that office. What the key part of this is, what we can then do is we can create a Microsoft Teams training as an example department. So instead of overwhelming them with all the features and functions, once we've done this mapping and we've created the department cheat sheet, we can then do a training session in the day of a life of a department, which it becomes very, very easy then, because you've created the model, you've set the framework for how you want that department to operate. And then what you've done then is apply a training session that wraps around that. So you're showing them, this is how you should use Teams on a day-to-day basis. This is when you should use Planner. This is when you should use the chats. And what we find is once that process has been done, the adoption of Teams lights up, and it becomes an ingrained process in that organization. It's not just here's the features and functions. You've actually implemented a brand new way of working. You've showed them how that's going to help with their current way of working, and you've then given them a training video and materials that they can follow up with on the back of that. So it becomes much, much easier for that team to see how you envisage this to work, as opposed to just expecting them to kind of get on with it and figure out their own way. The next piece around this is, if we go back a few slides, is the training side of things. So there's a few different options that we can have, and obviously training is very, very important to make sure that we adopt Microsoft 365. And there's some resources that are available for doing so. Microsoft have some excellent resources. Learning Pathways is a SharePoint portal that you can deploy in a couple of clicks, which gives you resources on how they can use OneDrive, how they can use SharePoint, and so on and so forth. They've also released a new web page recently called the Adoption Center. So if you search for adoption.microsoft.com, there's a whole host of tools in here that can help you guys get started with all of the different platforms that are available within here, from getting started, building champions, and you can jump into each of these and there's specific resources for each of them. So this is a fantastic tool for champions and users in your organization. So those are the kind of free resources that are available that you can get right now. The next piece then obviously is looking at the end users and the champions. So once we've defined that way of working, my department being an example, we would recommend then you look at creating bespoke training. So as I said, a day in the life of working as a department for using Microsoft Teams, or a day of how to use SharePoint Online as an intranet. But very much you need to tie those features and functions back to how they currently work as a department. We're not looking to just train them on it. We're looking to try and change the way they work by using these new tools, and you really need to show them how they're going to do that. So training is key. Training courses and certifications are available as well, which I'll cover off at the end. And at the very bottom here, as 95% of training is currently being held remotely, you should look at recording every single session and then uploading that to Microsoft Streamer as a portal. So we've done lots of work with organizations doing these bespoke training sessions where we've kind of said, this is Valto's way of working. And we've done 3 half-day sessions through all the different platforms that are available and recorded those. So what we now have is what we call the Valto Academy. And whenever we have a new starter join the organization, they jump into those 3 half-day recordings and they can see exactly how we operate, and they can join the business and get started using all the new tools and features straight away. So we find that once you've got these training sessions, having them recorded and then integrating them into your induction process is a great way of making sure that they start to work in the way that you do. So some tips and tricks on this. As I said, look at creating cheat sheets for each of the services and teams that are available. We definitely want to tie those features back. Don't just train people on every single feature and expect them to get using it. Another good trick I've got here is map out the usage of a SharePoint and Teams area for 90 days. So quite often when someone's looking at creating a new social team, or they might be creating a new project team, you would find it very useful, if it's your first team to do this, to try and map out how you'd expect that team is going to plan out for 90 days. So when I create a new social team, I might be running one on mental health awareness. I would expect that the person who's requesting that team for mental health awareness kind of maps out a 90-day plan. So how can we get people engaged with Teams and SharePoint? What's the plan? How often are you going to post messages? What features are you going to use? You're going to use Planner to show the tasks that are available. So we want them to kind of come up with this plan to say, I plan to do a weekly video meeting and record it. I plan to post news and announcements every 14 days. And it just really helps them think about, well, I'm doing a new project. I want to get the most out of Teams. So I'm going to map out my plan and make sure we've come up with a clear way to do so. I'd also recommend that you deploy resources that will assist with this. So there's a training portal, which I'll show you on the next slide. And then finally, with organizations who've really got half their toe in the water of Teams and still using emails, one of the most impactful ways we've been able to get organizations using these platforms is to force a period of usage on them. So if you're working with the finance team or another team in an organization and they're sort of half using Teams but still reverting back to emails, challenge that department to say, why don't you use Teams for 2 weeks? So no other communication. Ensure that as a team, you're enforcing it. So if someone reverts back to an old way, then someone's policing that and saying, let's do Teams. And then for that 2-week period, just embrace that technology, force yourself into it and see what the outcome is. If after the 2 weeks you do a review and everybody says email was much better, fine, at least we've proven that now. But 99% of the time, once they've forced themselves into that world and they're making sure that they're using the platform, every department we've worked with would never go back to the previous way of working. So we find it's a very good way of getting people up to speed and making sure that we want them to use the platform, and that's the way we do it. This is an example of a champion platform. So every Teams project that we do, we look to deploy alongside it a champions portal. So everyone in the organization would have access to this. It's clearly got the about and the vision, and we've also got some of the key champions in the organization, and then some links and videos. So the idea of this is everyone can just jump into this. If they need help, they can see who the champions that they need to contact are. They can see some additional resources and links, and this dates can have all of the change communications and the plans that are coming up as well. So tying back into my change communication strategy at the beginning, this can show the upcoming training courses, the announcements, and everyone can see what's going on. So Champions Portal is very good at bringing that together. We talked about putting the cheat sheet in there. So once you've created those department cheat sheets or the Teams cheat sheets, you can drop those in. We can then move on to champions. So champions are really key in making sure that we adopt Microsoft 365. So within your organization, you want to find people who are enthusiastic, they want to embrace this technology, and that they're going to help kind of enforce and influence this across the organization. So how do we build successful champions? The first piece is we want to recruit enthusiastic ones. So at the very beginning, if we can email people out and try and get some people to volunteer for this, that's a fantastic way to get some people who would be keen on rolling this out. The second piece then is kind of asking the departments if they could identify someone who would be a good champion as well. The champions should be given advanced training sessions and guidance. So back to my training session, I wouldn't recommend you just, again, train a champion on, here's all the features and functions of Teams, here's how you do a meeting, here's how you do the files. What we want those champions to understand is, here's how you identify opportunities in your organizations where Teams will be good. So we can say, right, if you see someone running a project and they're using Zoom for meetings, they've got a file server set up somewhere else and they're using Trello as a task management software, that would be a fantastic opportunity for them to jump in and say, have you considered using Teams? It brings the files, the meetings and everything into one place. Oh, and hey, I've set up this project team to show you an example of how it works. So what we want from those champions is for them to be trained up on identifying those opportunities. We also want them to have the capability of running their own training sessions, providing ad hoc guidance. So it's just making sure we do that with them. So champions in an organization help by building influence. If we force a company, as I said, to try and just embrace Teams for 2 weeks, the champions can be those enforcers. They can be making sure that we are using that new way of working and making sure that if people are stuck or struggling, they can get access to questions and help them out that way. They can also identify the areas in which new ways of working can be brought in. So these champions should be able to get regular updates on the new features and functions that are coming. And finally, they can feed back to the project owners about what's going on. So we need the project owners to be aware of what people are saying about these platforms, whether it's good or bad, and how we can improve. We can support champions in an organization by providing them advanced training and giving them specialist support. We'd also recommend that you create a dedicated resource. So create a team just for the champions in your organization and allow them to then share resources, training agendas, questions where they're stuck. Try and foster this spirit where they can work together to help train the organization. They should be able to utilize the Microsoft 365 training resources. So as part of the training, show them those resources, show them how they use them. And also encourage the champions to create contests, so scavenger hunts where they might say hide certain pieces of information as a competition within Teams and SharePoint, just to get people using the platform and talking about it. Microsoft have an excellent resource called a Build Champions Program Guide, which I've linked on here, and I'll send everyone the link to this afterwards. But this is kind of how a champions might plan what they're doing. So very similar to what we've talked about, but some useful information in there, especially around getting on the early adoption with the champions. The champions can help identify and launch additional solutions, and they can also help us with governance and identifying third parties as well that might help with this. So that's useful, and if you click on this, there's a fantastic PowerPoint from Microsoft with a lot more information on the champions. So there's some resources and certifications available. So I'll send this presentation on, as I said. Our YouTube channel now has quite a lot of videos. If you haven't seen the previous masterclass session, jump into that because we've got loads of things on creating a strategy, securing Microsoft 365. We've got a free Teams training session on there if you're looking for some guidance. So I definitely recommend you look into there and subscribe. We've got a Microsoft adoption portal, which I showed you very briefly. Microsoft are adding loads of stuff into there. For your champions, there's a good course called the Microsoft Service Adoption Specialist course, which is hosted by EDX. It's a self-paced learning thing, and you can get a certification on the back of it, but it's great for your champions to get some tips and tricks and go through a structured training course. And then, as I mentioned, there's the learning pathways. So you can deploy those to your SharePoint environment with a couple of clicks, and it'll give your users a training portal that they can jump into. Obviously, this was a snippet on building a Microsoft 365 adoption strategy, but we do host loads of different types of workshops. So if you wanted to get some help with us from developing that adoption strategy, then we get in touch with hello@valto.co.uk or send me an email, hugh@valto.co.uk, and we can jump on a call and kind of see what the best way forward would be. And then finally, we've got some time now for questions and answers. So if anybody has those questions, please post them now. I can see that I've had a few that have been posted. So first one, which is from Anis, which is, could communication with the leadership team happen in Jan rather than Feb, as part of your team could be the stakeholders? Yeah, so exactly that initial adoption strategy piece that I showed you at the very beginning, that can definitely come earlier. So often we might do Microsoft 365 demos and overviews to get the stakeholders bought into the platform. It may be that IT are excited about it, but we need to get the stakeholders involved as well. So that demo could come a lot sooner in that process rather than at the end. The question from Anonymous, which is, I use SharePoint for my own organization and clients have given me access to their organizations and I'm logged in. Yeah, so that is a bit of a challenge. You can switch your organizations in the top right-hand corner of Teams, but if you find that that's causing a problem, you might be better either getting a user created in their environment, or you can use something like Franz, which allows you to have multiple accounts set up in one view. And then another question, which is just around how do you flag or save messages within a chat? So there's a new feature that's coming soon, which will allow you to flag and add those messages to your to-do. Is there any questions, any further questions from anybody around adoption or guidance around that area? Okay. Then the next session that we're looking to do is a Microsoft Masterclass Series, which is around mastering Microsoft Teams on the 16th of February. So within this session, we'll be looking at doing a deep dive into how Microsoft 365 and Microsoft Teams can be utilized in your organization and how you can roll that out and get your organization using it properly. So thank you very much for your time, everybody. I hope you enjoyed the presentation, and I'll catch up with you soon.